My daughter called me every morning at 7:30. Not to say good morning, not to ask how I slept. The first words out of her mouth every single time were always the same. "Dad, have you talked to anyone about the property?" At first I thought she was just being practical. After her mother passed, there was a lot to sort through. The house on Ridgecrest Road outside of Guelph, the savings accounts, the RRSP that June had been adding to since 1987. I understood that these things needed to be dealt with. I was 68 years old and I'd just buried my wife of 41 years. I wasn't exactly moving fast on anything. But the calls kept coming, every morning, 7:30, like clockwork. I'd be standing at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching the frost melt off the back garden, and my phone would buzz on the counter. Her name on the screen. And I'd feel something I still can't quite name. Not dread, exactly. More like the feeling you get when you notice a crack in a wall you painted yourself, small enough to ignore, too familiar to forget. Her name was Becca, my youngest. She lived 40 minutes away in Kitchener with her husband, a man named Troy who sold commercial insurance and had never once in 14 years of marriage looked me in the eye for more than 3 seconds at a stretch. June never trusted Troy. She told me once, about a year before she got sick, that there was something about the way he counted things. Counted pieces of food on his plate. Counted the chairs at a table before he sat down. "Men who count everything are keeping score," she said. June had a way of putting her finger on things that I always thought was just intuition. Now I think it was wisdom I kept mistaking for pessimism. She passed in October. Breast cancer, 3rd time. The first 2 times she'd fought it back with something close to fury. The 3rd time, she was tired. I held her hand in the hospice room on a Tuesday afternoon, while rain came sideways off Lake Erie, and she looked at me and said, "Don't let anyone rush you." I didn't know what she meant then. I thought she was talking about grief. By December, Becca was calling every day. By January, Troy had started coming along for Sunday dinners and steering every conversation back to getting things organized. He'd use that phrase, getting things organized. Like the house I'd lived in for 32 years was a filing cabinet that needed sorting. "You really should talk to a lawyer, Dad," Becca said one Sunday, while I was washing up and Troy sat at my kitchen table with his coat still on. "Someone local. There's a man in Cambridge. Becca's colleague uses him. He handles estates, makes everything simple." I said I had my own lawyer. I'd been using Don Mercer on Wyndham Street since 1994. Don knew me. Don knew June. He'd helped us write our wills years ago and updated them after the kids were grown. "Don's retirement age," Troy said, without looking up from his phone. "You want someone current." I turned off the tap, dried my hands on the dish towel June had bought at a market in Prince Edward County the summer before she got sick. Blue and white stripes, tiny embroidered fish along the hem. I folded it over the oven handle the way she always did. "Don suits me fine," I said. Troy smiled the way he always smiled, like he was being patient with someone who didn't understand the question. The morning calls shifted after that. Still 7:30. But now Becca started asking things in a different way. Not, "Have you talked to anyone?" but "Have you signed anything yet?" And when I said no, there'd be a pause, just a half second, but I'd learned to hear it. And then she'd say, "Okay, good." Just making sure no one's taking advantage. Taking advantage. As if I were a child. As if the people taking advantage weren't the ones calling me every morning at 7:30. I want to be clear about something. I loved my daughter. I still do. Whatever happened, whatever she convinced herself was reasonable, whatever Troy had worked out in that counting mind of his, she was still the little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest during hockey games. who called me from a payphone in Banff at 2 in the morning because she'd lost her wallet and was scared and just wanted to hear my voice. That person existed. She was real. What happened later doesn't erase her. But something had changed. I could feel it the way you feel weather coming in off the lake. A pressure shift. Something tightening. It was my neighbor, a man named Frederick, who first put it in words for me. Frederick was 73, a retired civil engineer who'd moved in next door after his own wife passed, and we had a habit of walking the trail behind the subdivision on Saturday mornings when the weather allowed. He'd lost his wife 4 years before I lost June, and there was a particular kind of understanding between us that didn't require much explaining. We were walking one February morning, boots on frozen ground, breath-making clouds. I'd been telling him about the calls, about Troy and the lawyer in Cambridge, about the way Becca had started asking, "Have you signed anything?" Frederick was quiet for a moment. He had a deliberate way of thinking that I come to trust. "What does your will currently say?" he asked. I told him. The house and its contents split evenly between Becca and my son, Louis, the RRSPs to Louis, who'd always been better with money. A portion to a conservation trust June had cared about, the Carolinian Forest Project down near Long Point. And they know this? I assume so. We talked about it years ago. Frederick nodded slowly. "And the Cambridge lawyer," he said. "Do you know anything about him?" I didn't. "I'd find out," Frederick said, and then he changed the subject to the hockey scores, the way he always did when he'd said enough. "I'm not a suspicious man by nature. I'd spent 35 years as a high school geography teacher in Wellington County. I knew teenagers. I knew when someone was working an angle and when they were just confused and scared. I'd made a career out of telling the difference. But when it came to my own family, I think I'd been giving too much benefit of the doubt for too long. June's death had left a hole in the house that still didn't feel real, and part of me, a larger part than I'm comfortable admitting, had been relieved that Becca was calling every day. Even if the calls felt wrong, at least someone was calling. Louis was in Vancouver. He worked in environmental consulting and had 2 young kids and a life that moved fast. He called on Sundays, later in the day, and we talked about the kids and hockey and how the garden was going to look in spring. He didn't ask about the will. He didn't ask about the will. He didn't ask about lawyers. Once, in January, he said, "You doing okay, Dad? Like actually okay?" And I said yes and changed the subject because I didn't know yet what I was dealing with. In March, I called Don Mercier. I didn't tell Becca. I just picked up the phone on a Thursday morning after her daily call and dialed Don's office and asked if I could come in. His assistant booked me for the following week. Simple as that. Don was 70 himself, slower than he used to be, but sharp in the ways that matter. He pulled up my file and we sat in his office on Wyndham that smelled like old carpet and printer ink, and I told him what had been happening. The calls. Troy's comments about him being retirement age, the lawyer in Cambridge. He listened without interrupting. Then he asked me one question. "Has anyone asked you to sign a document in the last 4 months?" I thought about it. There had been one thing. A form Troy had slid across the table at a Sunday dinner in January. He'd described it as a property pre-authorization. Something about streamlining the estate process, avoiding probate delays. I'd picked it up, read the first paragraph, and set it back down. Said I'd look at it later. It had never come back up. Don asked me to describe it as best I could. I did. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That sounds like a power of attorney document. A financial one." I felt the floor move slightly, not literally, but in the way it does when something you suspected but wouldn't let yourself believe becomes real. "If you'd signed it," Don said, "Troy and Becca would have had legal authority to make financial decisions on your behalf. Sell property, access accounts. Without any further input from you, provided they could argue you were incapacitated or simply that you'd granted them the power voluntarily. I stared at the photograph on his desk, his grandkids, 2 of them, gap-toothed and grinning. "I didn't sign it," I said. "No," Don said, "you didn't." I drove home through the grey March afternoon and sat in June's chair by the window for a long time. The cattle farmer 2 properties over was moving his fence line, and I watched him work without really seeing him. I kept thinking about that dish towel, those little embroidered fish. I kept thinking about what June had said. Don't let anyone rush you. She'd known, not specifically, but she'd known something about how grief can be used against a person, how the love you have for someone can be turned into a door and walked right through. I didn't confront Becca. Not yet. That was Frederick's advice when I told him what Don had said. "Don't tip your hand," Frederick said. "Find out how far it's gone first." So I did something that felt dishonest, but wasn't. I let the calls keep coming. I answered at 7:30. I said things like, "I haven't done anything yet," and "still thinking it over." I listened to the pauses. And I called Lewis. That was the conversation I'd been putting off. Lewis is not a confrontational person. He's methodical and careful, and he hates family conflict with a visceral aversion that I think came from watching June and her sister fight over their mother's estate years ago. He avoids anything that feels like that. I knew telling him would pull him into something he didn't want to be in. I told him everything anyway, the morning calls, the form at the dinner table, what Don had said. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "How long has this been going on?" he asked finally. "Since November," I said. "Maybe before." Another silence. Then, "Dad, I had no idea." "I know." "Does she know that you know?" "No." Lewis exhaled. I could hear his youngest in the background, some cartoon playing. "Okay," he said. "Okay, what do you need me to do?" I told him I needed him to come home. He was on a flight from Vancouver to Toronto Pearson 4 days later. I hadn't seen him since Thanksgiving, and he looked older in the way that children do when you don't see them regularly. Not aged, exactly, but settled. More like himself. He had June's eyes, and her way of standing with his arms crossed when he was worried, and seeing him in my kitchen that Saturday morning made something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was clenched. We didn't tell Becca he was coming. Don Mercer had helped me do one thing in the intervening days. He'd reviewed my existing will and drafted a simple codicil, a small addition that created an added layer of documentation around the Ridgecrest Road property specifically. Nothing that changed the terms, just something that would make any hasty transfer more difficult, more visible, a paper trail. He'd also written a letter to the law office in Cambridge under the guise of a routine professional inquiry, asking about the firm's services. The response he received described a practice that specialized in estate restructuring for seniors. It confirmed what we already suspected. The Sunday dinner arrived. Becca and Troy pulled in at 12:30, and I watched from the kitchen window as Troy climbed out of their SUV and reached back inside for something, a folder, buff-colored. He tucked it under his arm. Lewis was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee, out of sight of the front window. I opened the door and let them in. Becca hugged me and looked tired in a way I hadn't let myself see before, tired and a little guarded. Troy shook my hand and kept the folder pressed against his ribs. We sat down to lunch. I'd made chicken and roasted potatoes, the same Sunday meal I'd been making since the kids were young. It tasted exactly the same as it always had. That seemed important somehow. Some things don't change just because others do. Troy waited until after the plates were cleared. He always waited until after the plates were cleared, I realized. When people were settled and relaxed and slightly food slow, then he set the folder on the table and smiled his careful smile. "We found a good moment to sort through the paperwork," he said. "It's very simple. A straightforward estate trust arrangement that'll protect the property from probate fees. Could save the family $20,000 or $30,000. He slid 2 documents from the folder. They were dense with legal language, the kind designed to look routine. He set a pen on top. "This really should just take a minute," he said. Becca was looking at her hands. And that's when Lewis walked out of the kitchen. I'll remember the look on Troy's face for the rest of my life. It wasn't guilt. Not initially. It was calculation. His eyes moved from Lewis to me to the documents and back to Lewis, and for just a second I could see him doing the math, figuring out what this changed, whether there was a version of this that still worked. There wasn't. "Hey sis," Lewis said quietly. Becca looked up, and the expression on her face, that was guilt, immediate and complete and awful to witness. The silence lasted a long time. Troy started to say something about how Lewis being there was great, how this concerned him too, how this was really about protecting everyone. Lewis let him talk. Then he set a folder of his own on the table. Don Mercer had prepared copies of the existing will, the new codicil, and his letter to the Cambridge law firm along with their response. "Dad already has this handled," Lewis said, "has had it handled for a while." Troy stopped talking. Becca said, "Dad, and then stopped. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands again. "I thought we were doing the right thing," she said. "It came out very small. I looked at my daughter. Really looked at her, the way you look at someone when you're trying to find the version of them you first knew. She was 58 years old and she looked frightened. I thought about the payphone in Banff. I thought about June saying, 'Don't let anyone rush you.' I thought about the dish towel with the little fish. 'I know you thought that,' I said, and I believed it. I believed that Becca had told herself a story about this that felt reasonable inside her own head. I believed that Troy had been the engine of it, and she'd been pulled along. That didn't make it right, but it was true." Troy left first. He picked up the folder and walked out of my house and sat in the SUV, and I haven't had a conversation with him since. Becca stayed. Lewis stayed. We sat at the table and we talked for 3 hours, the kind of talking that's really a kind of reckoning, slow and uncomfortable and necessary. Becca cried. Lewis was quiet and careful. I was mostly tired. At one point Becca said, "I was afraid you'd leave the house to a charity and we'd get nothing." I asked her when I'd ever given her reason to believe I didn't care about my own children. She didn't have an answer. That told me a lot about what Troy had been putting in her ear for years. I updated my will after that. The terms didn't change much, but I added something I hadn't had before, a requirement that any changes to the estate be witnessed by both Don Mercer and Frederick, who I listed as a trusted, independent party. Don thought it was unconventional. I thought it was June. I still live in the house on Ridgecrest Road. The garden came back in spring the way it always does. The hostas first along the fence, then the peonies June planted the year we moved in, big and pink and slightly ridiculous. I keep the dish towel on the oven handle. Frederick and I still walk the trail on Saturday mornings. Lewis courts on Sundays. Becca courts less often now, and when she does, she doesn't ask about property. We're finding our way back to something, slowly, carefully, the way you do when trust has been broken and you're choosing to repair it anyway. Not because it's easy. Because she's my daughter and she was scared and she made a terrible choice and she's trying to be better. Troy filed for divorce 8 months later. I won't pretend I was surprised. I think about June's words more than I used to. Don't let anyone rush you. She wasn't only talking about grief, I understand now. She was talking about everything, about decisions and documents and the quiet ways that people who love you can also, sometimes, lose their way. She was saying, take your time, pay attention, know what you're signing. I didn't always manage that, but the morning she needed me to, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee, watching the frost melt, and I set that pen back down. That was enough. I still think about that pen, the way it sat on top of Troy's documents like it was waiting for me, patient, certain I'd reach for it eventually. I almost did, not that day, but there were other moments, earlier ones, when I was still telling myself that Becca was just worried, that Troy was just practical, that grief had made me suspicious of people who were only trying to help. I came close to talking myself into it. That's the part I don't say out loud very often. What stopped me wasn't cleverness. It was a habit June spent 41 years building in me. The habit of slowing down when something feels slightly off. Not panic, not accusation, just stillness. Set it down. Look again tomorrow. She modeled that for me so many times that eventually it became mine too, without me fully realizing it. When I picked up that document in January and read the first paragraph and set it back down, I wasn't being strategic. I was just being the person she'd helped me become. That matters to me, because the lesson I took from all of this isn't really about estate law or powers of attorney, as important as those things turned out to be. It's about what happens when you let the people you trust shape your instincts over decades. June's honesty made me more honest. Frederick's steadiness made me more steady. Don's careful thinking gave me permission to think carefully too. We become, in some real way, the company we keep. And when trouble arrives, it's that accumulated character that either holds or doesn't. Becca didn't lose her integrity because she was a bad person. She lost it in small steps, each one feeling justifiable, over years of living beside someone who counted everything and trusted nothing. That's worth sitting with. The choices we make about who to share our lives with aren't just personal preferences. They're decisions about who we're going to become. Troy didn't change Becca overnight. He changed her the way water changes stone, gradually, quietly, until one day she was sitting at her father's table looking at her hands. I think about Lewis too. He flew across the country without hesitating when I needed him. He sat at that table and didn't raise his voice once. That kind of strength, the kind that's calm instead of loud, that shows up instead of just promising to, that's built over years of small decisions to do the right thing, even when it's inconvenient. It doesn't appear from nowhere. The hardest thing I did through all of this wasn't confronting Troy or updating my will. It was calling Lewis and telling him the truth when I'd spent months trying to handle it quietly, alone. There's a particular stubbornness that comes with getting older, a belief that asking for help is the same as admitting failure. It isn't. Knowing when you need another set of eyes, when your own love for someone is clouding your judgment, that's not weakness. That takes more courage than most people give it credit for. I still walk the trail with Frederick on Saturday mornings. The peonies came back this spring, same as always. Some things hold.